What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today I'll be answering more of your questions surrounding different running backs, and then also a strategy question about like roster construction that I just found interesting, so I wanted to share with you guys. Before we do that though, obviously gotta start things off with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was through Sunday, which running back faced the highest percent of light boxes, and the answer is J.D. McKissic. No one's gotten that one yet, but I'm sure someone will. Today's stat: how many rookie running backs currently rank, and this is currently as of Monday morning, so don't count the Monday game, currently rank inside the top 15 in half PPR scoring this season. So, the running backs you guys wanted me to break down this week are Miles Sanders, Jonathan Taylor, Cam Akers again, although I've done Taylor and Akers a lot recently, so those questions will be answered very quickly, and then they're retired. I'm not talking about them next week. I bet you it'll be like a minute and a half for those two combined. So Miles Sanders, Taylor, and Akers. Then after that, we're going to do Swift, James Conner, and then we'll get to that question surrounding basically what you do when you're going up against different studs. They named Derrick Henry in particular, but what you can do, if anything, when you're facing those players. Also, as always, you can see exactly when I'll be talking about each player. In the upper corner, it tells you who I'm talking about, but then also at the bottom of the screen, there's timestamps. So if you only want one or two of these guys, we'll just skip to that part. You don't need to listen to everything if you don't want to. So we'll start off with the same situation we've been starting off with for probably the last month, and that's the Eagles. Just so you know, I don't think anyone wouldn't know at this point, but if you hadn't heard, Jalen Hurts replaced Carson Wentz, and the team looked completely different as a result. One very important thing I want to note is the offensive line. Their line is nowhere near as good as it has been over these last few years. It's probably been, like 2 or 3 years now in a row where every season we're looking at this and saying, you know, they've got a really solid offensive line. They'll suffer injuries, but in general, they're above average. This season, they've had a lot of injuries, and so it's just not a strength of this team. But it is not even close to as bad as Carson Wentz made it seem. So if you watch an Eagles game, you probably come out thinking that they have like the worst offensive line you could possibly imagine. That is not the case. Carson Wentz is just trash, and he holds onto the ball forever. He does not evade any sort of pressure. He doesn't take care of the ball at all, which, you know what, Hurts isn't perfect. You know, he had a brutal fumble, like a fumble you cannot take as an NFL quarterback late in their game against the Saints. He gave the Saints an opportunity to win that game. So I'm not saying Hurts is perfect, but he took 0 sacks against the Saints. The Saints are a top 3 defense. This is a game where if Carson Wentz was the quarterback, like, he would have taken 5 or 6 sacks. He would have thrown multiple interceptions, multiple fumbles. Like, it would have been horrendous to watch. And what do we know about sacks? They're drive killers, and they just absolutely tank your chances of scoring, especially a touchdown on that drive. And so when we see Wentz taking sacks over and over again, losing the ball, fumbling, throwing interceptions, that really hurts the running backs because they're never playing with a positive game script. They're never consistently getting into the red zone. That's going to hurt. It's very difficult for a running back to produce under those circumstances. And so when you add in Hurts' ability to improve in those areas with his mobility, we know that rushing quarterbacks, they make the job of a running back much easier just because they add so much extra pressure onto linebackers and their decision making. Just the threat of Jalen Hurts is going to make Miles Sanders more efficient, at least the vast majority of the time. Like, not every single week, every single play, but over time, Miles Sanders will be more efficient. And so what does all of this mean for the Eagles? Well, the Saints, you know, they hadn't allowed a 100-yard rusher in like 20 years, obviously an exaggeration, but it was like 50-something games they hadn't allowed a 100-yard rusher. And then in Hurts' first start, both Sanders and Jalen go over 100. Now, one note on Miles Sanders, like, Hurts was getting it consistently, you know, in good chunks, but that's to be expected with a quarterback. You know, we're not expecting him to get like 5 yards, 5 yards, 5 yards for, 20 carries for 200 yards. You know, he's not Lamar Jackson. He's not going to take off that frequently. We're going to expect it to be more in 10 and 15 yard chunks. But for Miles Sanders, you got to remember he had that 80-yard rushing touchdown, and so he only had 13 carries for like in the mid 30s for yards beyond that one play. He did score 2 touchdowns. Obviously, his stat line was incredible, but just know it wasn't that Miles Sanders was breaking off 9 yards, 10 yards a pop every single play against the best run defense, or I guess second best. I don't know. It's probably the Bucs first, but then the Saints are right there. One of the best defenses in football. Most of it came on the one carry. So it was a little similar to remember that game in Pittsburgh where he had like, I don't remember how many carries, but we're just going to guess in the low teens maybe for carries. And it was for like 80 yards, but 75 and a touchdown came on one carry. So for most of the game, he wasn't doing anything. Kind of similar here. He wasn't doing a lot for a large portion of the game, but it was still a better performance than he would have done with Carson Wentz. Both Wentz and the coaching staff were holding Miles Sanders back, but all of those things were kind of canceled out when Hurts comes back in because the coaching staff is able to do so many more things with Jalen at quarterback. And so what do we see? We see Miles Sanders play 81% of the snaps, handle 82% of the running back touches. His role is back. He should be more efficient. They should have more scoring chances. And remember what I said at the beginning of this. It is so incredibly important for running back to be put in opportunities to score fantasy points with touchdowns as opposed to just taking sacks, making turnovers, getting into negative game scripts. And those are all things that Carson Wentz did. And so if they can drop 24 on the Saints, they easily have 30-point upside against the Cardinals and the Cowboys over the next 2 weeks. So I did say I'd be benching Miles Sanders last week. Of course, I record these videos, like I said, on Mondays because the Monday night game gets over at like 11:15 or so here in the East Coast, and I can't record after that. So I didn't know that Antonio Gibson was going to get hurt. I was planning on playing Gibson over Miles Sanders. I guess unlucky for Gibson, lucky for me that happened. But I will, after this performance, absolutely be starting Miles Sanders going forward because, again, the role is back, should be more efficient, should be more scoring opportunities, and the offense in general is going to play much better under Jalen Hurts. Next up, you guys want another breakdown on Jonathan Taylor, and I think that this will, like I said, be the last week we go over Taylor and Akers. So very briefly on those two. Starting in week 11, it has been very clear that they are shifting the workload away from the committee into majority Jonathan Taylor. They will never get 100% of the work to Jonathan Taylor, or at least this season, maybe in the future they will. Hines will get work, but if we look at Wilkins, his snap share has been tanking these last few weeks. He had 2 touches last week, 6 total snaps. It is absolutely clear that Jonathan Taylor is the guy they want. He had 22 touches, 165 yards, multiple scores. He's averaging 138 yards a game over the last 3 weeks. You're playing Jonathan Taylor every week moving forward. You have been playing him most likely, and he's probably a top 5 running back play this week against the Texans. Lock him into lineups if you got him. I will also be retiring, as I said, Cam Akers. His role is set now. If you remember, beginning of the year, middle of the year, I said we're not trusting a Rams running back until someone gets 60% of the work. And then 2 weeks ago, Akers got 60% of the work. So he further cemented it this week. He had virtually all of the running back snaps, the running back touches. He was the clear feature back. And you start to clear feature back on teams that really like to run the ball, who have good offenses, good upside for touchdowns. So you're absolutely starting Jonathan Taylor. You're absolutely starting Cam Akers. But how about some running backs that we haven't gone over as much recently? So first up, DeAndre Swift. So he misses the last, I believe it was 2 weeks. I know it was at least 2 weeks with the concussion and then the illness, which was kind of a strange thing. It's possible that they brought him back from the concussion protocol a little bit before he was good to go, and they called it an illness, but it was still kind of the concussion. We can't possibly know, but regardless, had the concussion, had the illness. He was back this last week, although as we've seen with players coming off the COVID list, coming off of concussions, coming off of illnesses, they do not always get their featured role back right away. He played 53% of the snaps, only had 7 carries, 5 targets, turned that into 50 total yards, and the score. The touchdown did save his day. Obviously, 50 yards with, I want to say, 3 receptions, no touchdown. Probably not going to do it for you, so definitely was nice seeing the touchdown. But what was even nicer, just not even talking about the fantasy points, was the fact that he got that touchdown. The fact that they were inside the 5-yard line, they were up at the red zone, and they gave it to him. They didn't take him off the field and bring in Adrian Peterson. They said, you know what, DeAndre, we're giving you the ball, you're scoring. If they brought him off the field every time they got inside the 10-yard line, his upside is immensely capped, because we know Peterson would be getting all the touchdowns, and so he'd need to score from like 20 yards out, and that's difficult, right? Like, it's not easy to score 20-yard touchdowns. Like, he can do it, but the upside is capped. You want that ability for someone to score close touchdowns. So the fact that he got that is key. And I also kind of want to talk about his floor, because it's pretty high. My guess is that they do ramp up his workload each week to close the season. I do not think he'll ever get like 80% of the work, but could he get, 60 to 70% of the total volume in this backfield? I think absolutely. I think 70% is in his range of outcomes. And if we look back, outside of week 3, when he only played 6 snaps, he has at least 3 receptions in every game. And for those of you playing in full PPR leagues, that is really nice to see. Someone who, in their worst case scenario, they're going to go out there and get you 3 receptions. And I know that like 3 receptions for 20 yards is 5 points, and you're like, Nick, I need more than 5 points. I'm talking about a floor. He's going to get carries too. And so if his floor is like 7 in PPR, that's pretty nice. And if this is also a player that we know is extremely talented, this is an offense that was being held back by Matt Patricia, who now that he's gone is going to be more aggressive and going to score more points. And we know this is a player that they were already trying to feature before the concussion, who now has the upside to be featured, crazy upside to close the season. Now, one thing we need to mention is Stafford. Is Matthew Stafford going to be healthy? I don't know. I mean, he gets hurt to close the last game. It was a rib injury. We have seen Matthew Stafford play through a ton of different injuries. I have no idea if he's going to be out there. Maybe when you're watching the video, maybe some sort of news comes out. I feel like we're probably going to get like, oh, he's out of practice. Oh, he's limited in practice. We don't really know. And then maybe we find out on like Saturday, Friday. I don't really know what's going to happen. But if Matthew Stafford is back, then I really, really like this offense playing Tennessee. I think that they could do a lot of really nice things. And if I have him in a league, I'd be very inclined to start him. The one league that I do have him in does have Jonathan Taylor, so I'm not starting him there. And then it has McCaffrey. And so if McCaffrey is back, I'm not going to play DeAndre Swift ahead of McCaffrey, and I'm not going to play him ahead of Jonathan Taylor. But if McCaffrey were out, I have Mostert, I have Gibson, who's probably going to be out as well. I would still feel very confident, again, if Matthew Stafford is back, in starting DeAndre Swift. I really think they'll ramp up his workload. I think the Titans are not that good of a defense, and he could easily have a game where he has like 5 receptions for 50 yards, he gets around 15 carries, and he is smashing in both half and full PPR leagues if that happens. If Matthew Stafford is out, it hurts a lot because the upside for touchdowns comes down. The upside for receptions comes down. The upside for yardage comes down because the offense is probably going to have fewer yards in general. Then I will need to make a decision. I will update the rankings. Of course, they are free for the fantasy playoffs. You can check that out, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. In general, you're going to want to look at those. I mean, they'll get posted on probably Tuesday because there's no Tuesday game this week, but I would probably start looking at those on Thursday. That's when I start really ramping up the adjustments for those Thursday, Friday, Saturday. You're just going to have to see where Swift is if Stafford is out, but hopefully he is in. Next up, we've got ourselves James Conner, and I've been talking about players who have really good outlooks so far, so I guess we got to include one player who does not have a good outlook to kind of balance things out. James has been pretty dreadful for, like a month, like 4 or 5 weeks. I guess his last 4 games played, which I think is 5 games for the Steelers because he did miss time, but roughly the last 4 to 5 weeks. He has seen, a pretty good drop in his volume, and with that, of course, like with any player, their volume drops, their floor and their ceiling also drop. If you're only getting 12 touches when you used to be getting 17, you're going to have dud weeks, and you're very much less likely to post a ceiling game. The reasons for this are twofold. One is the offense. This is a quick passing offense. They use quick outs, they use screens, just everything short as an extension of the run game, and that does not benefit running backs. Running backs get their receptions off of screens, of course, to running backs, which the Steelers are not running as many of recently. But also, when the quarterback drops back, he has 2 or 3 reads, they're not open, the running back gets a dump. But if the Steelers are running an offense where the reads are 1 to 2 seconds into the drop back, and it's pretty much always going to be open. I mean, quick outs, how are you really going to cover like a 3-yard out? Like, it's going to be open, he's going to throw the ball. So when you have an offense like that, the running backs don't get as many receptions. So reception upside, capped. We know that the Steelers were undefeated for a while, and yet they were still amongst the leaders in pass play rate. Even when they're winning in games, they're passing the ball, and when they're down, they're passing the ball a ton. So there go the carries. So we've already taken away a ton of targets, we've taken away a ton of carries, and the offense in general recently has not been that amazing, and they throw the ball a ton near the goal line too. All of those are extremely negative for the running back. But there were still 17 carries and 4 targets to all running backs available this past week, and if you look at that, you're like, okay, if someone's a feature back though, they're still viable under those circumstances. Fortunately, Connor is not the featured back. They're using McFarland, not last week, he was inactive, but they're using like that type of player, McFarland or Samuels, sometimes, whichever one's active. Samuels was out, so they use McFarland. McFarland's out, they use Samuels. They always have Benny Snell in there for a few touches, and so when you have that, it results in a week like last week, where James Conner had 0 targets and 10 carries. Samuels had 4 targets, 4 carries. Snell had 0 targets, 3 carries. No one is viable under those circumstances. And so when you add all of this up, it's not great. The one saving grace, if you want to look at a positive this week, the Bengals are dumpster fire. And so the Steelers are going to stomp them. I don't really see an outcome where the Steelers don't win big here, at least win big by like the margin. They're not necessarily going to drop like 30, 35 points. They could, absolutely. They're not necessarily going to do that, but I mean, this Bengals offense is going to score what, like 10 points? They're not going to do anything. So the Steelers will probably be generally more conservative, which means maybe they do run the ball more. So there are some positives for Connor this week. Again, I would look at the rankings. I haven't looked through every single matchup of every running back, so I don't know where Connor will stack up. But the volume's not there. He'll need to score a touchdown. He'll need to be a little bit efficient. And those are just not things that have been there for James Conner recently. And so another thing you got to look at is you're in the semifinals right now, right? I mean, this is semifinal weekend. And so did you get there with James Conner? I'd be shocked. I'd be genuinely shocked if you got there. Outside of like a 16-team league, maybe you're using Conner to get you to the semifinals. But for, I'd say, 99% of people, they did not use James Conner to get to the semifinals. And so for you to all of a sudden put him in your lineup ahead of the people who've gotten you there, to me, probably doesn't make that much sense, because your team is clearly decent. I mean, no one's making it to the semifinals with a terrible team. Your team is pretty solid. You probably have options. And if you've got options, I would probably prefer to play them ahead of James Conner. Again, I don't know who you have. You'll have to check the rankings. But in general, I'm thinking we're kind of done with James Conner at this point in the season. The final question is more strategy-based, which I like more than any other question. And so someone asked, is there anything we can do to counter our opponent having Derrick Henry? At face value, obviously no, right? Like if your opponent has Derrick Henry, there is nothing you can do short of trying out for that team and trying to stop him yourself, which you're not going to be able to do. Like Derrick Henry is going to go off. Like he is just a phenomenal running back. He always goes off in December. He's had these soft matchups. He's just going to go off. There's nothing you can do to combat that. But what you can do is alter your own roster construction. If you're playing a guy like Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook, Tyreek Hill, these guys that have, 40, 50 points in the range of outcomes, well, you need to look at your own roster and realize that you got to be starting players with a ceiling. Everyone loves to just start their best projected lineup, but sometimes you still need access to ceiling in order to take down teams that have stud players. I played against Derrick Henry this past week, and if you forgot, I posted 200 yards, 2 touchdowns, which I think is exactly what I said in the running back video. I said that it was just a smash spot for Derrick Henry, and since I was going against him, you know he's going to go absolutely berserk. And he did. In our league, it is full PPR, no bonuses, so he got 36.2 points. That is going to win you a lot of weeks. But honestly, I mean, Henry could have had 500 yards. It didn't matter. Like, I'm up 80 points right now, and he's got the Ravens and Marquise Brown. So unless you're watching this and you're like, oh, wow, stinks for Nick. You know, Marquise Brown had 400 receiving yards and multiple touchdowns, and the Ravens also brought back multiple pick sixes. Like, I'm going to win. And that is in a week with Patrick Mahomes scoring 18 points, one of his lower efforts of the season, and none of my players matching Henry, because I'm pretty sure he was the highest scorer on the week across all positions. Maybe a quarterback outscored him, but I feel like Henry was the highest scorer this week. And you'll see this a lot in DFS, but like my best week of the season, I got second place in a tournament, and it was playing Will Fuller in the week that he didn't go off. Like, Will Fuller went off in almost every single week, of course, except for the week where if he had a good game, I win first place. But I still got second place with Will Fuller putting up a dud, and it's because the rest of my team was built with so much upside at every single position that pretty much all of them hit, and it didn't matter at all what Will Fuller did. You know, I could afford to have a dud in there. Now, it doesn't translate perfectly since you're starting a lineup of only your roster, and so you don't have access to an entire player pool like you do in DFS. But if you're facing one of these studs who can drop 40, then you got to make sure that you're not starting a bunch of players who have like a decent projection, but who don't really deviate from there. Like, if you're starting players who always score 10 to 13 points, like, that's fine, but when Henry drops 40, he just outscored 3 to 4 players on your roster. So you need someone who has access to a 25-point ceiling. Like, look at DeAndre Washington last week. A lot of people wanted to play Washington. He was like a fine play. He was going up against a defense that wasn't that great on the ground, and he was going to get around like 11 to 13 carries, around 2 to 3 targets. So projection-wise, he was solid. He was a pretty good fill-in. But while the Chiefs have a bad run defense, I mean, how much damage could Washington have possibly done last week? Like, his ceiling was probably, 15 fantasy points? Maybe his 99th percentile ceiling was closer to like 20. He could have scored multiple touchdowns. He could have broken off like a really long run. But in general, like an 80th percentile ceiling is probably like 15 for DeAndre Washington last week, because what sort of game script, like, unless you think the Dolphins were just going to stomp the Chiefs, what game script was he going to get 20 touches? And so I would much rather start someone who, on average, does not score as much as DeAndre Washington was projected. Maybe his projection is like 2 or 3 points lower, but I know there's a game script where they score 25. Well, I'd much rather play that player who's scoring 25. Again, this is assuming the question. The question was, if I'm going against Derrick Henry, and I'm pretty sure he's going to score 35, and I'm down a lot in the projection, what do I do to win? It's ceiling. You know, if you're playing someone who has a solid projection, but you look at their lineup and it's the opposite. They don't have Derrick Henry. They don't have Tyreek Hill or Dalvin Cook. They've just got a lot of like good players, but players that don't really see spikes. You don't have to do this. You do not have to play players who have immense ceiling. Obviously, you'd like players who are really good and have a great ceiling, but in general, you are starting them anyways. This is really a discussion about that second running back spot, that second flex spot, like those types of players where you're like, okay, I've got 2 players projected for like 12 and 10. Do I just start the 12? Not necessarily. Look at their box scores. Look at the Vegas line. Think about this game in general. What do you think is going to happen in this game? Is one team going to be down quick and need to throw? Is one team going to be up and be able to run? Think about the potential outcomes, because that's going to help you make a decision as to which player has a higher ceiling. And finally, if you don't have a player who is capable of producing that ceiling, you need it, there is free agency. And I know that at this point in the season, it's pretty thin, but there might be someone on free agency, it would probably be at the wide receiver position, who has that, who has access to that sort of ceiling. And I know it would feel very scary to go after someone like that and just bring him in for the semifinals. But if you're looking at your team and you're going up against like both Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry, and you're like 9 times out of 10 I lose this matchup, at least go down swinging. Don't just start a lineup that you know is going to lose 90% of the time. At least give yourself an out if things go right. So, those are my thoughts on some running backs you guys asked for a breakdown on. Remember that you can ask more questions in the comment section of this video or tweet them at me at NickZilikFFA because I do the exact same thing again for wide receivers tomorrow. That, my friends, is the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, then how about hitting the like button and how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.